It was a bright summer afternoon, the kind of day that begged for relaxation. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything, and there wasn't a single cloud in sight. The warmth wrapped around me as I leaned back in my poolside lounge chair, a cold drink in my hand, basking in the quiet comfort of my own backyard. My house, a modest but cozy place I had worked hard to afford, was my sanctuary, and my pool was my escape from the stress of daily life. I wasn't one for neighborhood drama. In fact, I kept mostly to myself, which in hindsight may have been a mistake. Because in the absence of my own narrative, my neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had crafted one of her own, a bizarre, completely unfounded story that would soon turn my peaceful afternoon into an absolute nightmare. Mrs. Caldwell had been a thorn in my side ever since I moved in. She was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the type of person who had to know everyone's business and felt entitled to enforce unwritten rules of community etiquette. She had a habit of peering through her curtains whenever I was outside, her sharp, judgmental eyes tracking my every move. I had learned to ignore it over the years, chalking it up to an annoying but ultimately harmless quirk. But today, she took things to an entirely new level. As I lay there, eyes closed, enjoying the warmth of the sun, I heard the unmistakable sound of a gate creaking open. At first, I thought it might be a delivery driver, or maybe even a lost pet wandering in. But when I opened my eyes, I was met with the sight of Mrs. Caldwell standing just a few feet away from me, arms crossed, a deep frown etched into her face. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice laced with suspicion. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I blinked in confusion, sitting up slightly. "What does it look like?" "I'm sunbathing in my own backyard," I replied, my voice calm but firm. She scoffed. "Your backyard? Are you sure about that?" I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. "Yes, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm very sure. I've lived here for years." She narrowed her eyes. "Funny, because I never see anyone visiting you. I don't see you getting mail. And I certainly don't see you keeping this place up like a proper homeowner should." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" "It means," she continued, her tone growing more condescending by the second, "that you don't act like you own this house. You keep to yourself, you don't interact with the neighbors, and now here you are, lounging by a pool like you have nowhere else to be. Frankly, you look homeless to me." For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. Was this woman serious? How did sunbathing in my own yard equate to being homeless? And why did she think she had the right to interrogate me like this? I let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Just because I don't throw barbecues or gossip on the sidewalk doesn't mean I don't live here." But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and waved it in my face. "I'm calling the cops," she announced. "We have rules in this neighborhood, and loitering is not allowed." I stared at her in disbelief. "Loitering? You do realize that's my house right there, right?" I pointed toward my home, hoping for a glimmer of reason. But she ignored me, already dialing. My stomach clenched. I had no doubt that the police would arrive, check my ID, and see that her claims were ridiculous. But the fact that she was actually going through with this, calling the cops on me for existing in my own backyard, was beyond infuriating. I debated grabbing my phone and calling them myself just to get ahead of whatever nonsense she was about to tell them. But I decided against it. I wasn't going to play into her paranoia. Instead, I crossed my arms and waited, my mind racing with the sheer absurdity of the situation. As Mrs. Caldwell paced, muttering indignantly into the phone, I glanced toward the other neighbors' houses, wondering if anyone else was watching this spectacle unfold. A couple of them were peeking out from their windows, their faces filled with curiosity. No one stepped in. No one told her to stop. Minutes passed, and then she hung up the phone, looking entirely too satisfied with herself. "They're on their way," she said, her voice smug. "And when they get here, you're going to have to explain why you're trespassing on someone else's property." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. This was going to be an interesting conversation. I sat there by my pool, staring at Mrs. Caldwell in disbelief as she stood with her arms crossed, her smug expression making my blood boil. It was one thing for her to be nosy, It was another to escalate the situation to this level. She had actually called the cops on me, claiming I was a homeless trespasser in my own backyard. The absurdity of it all was almost comical, but I knew better than to laugh. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor being difficult. This was a woman so convinced of her own twisted narrative that she was willing to get law enforcement involved. I considered going inside to grab my ID and proof of residency, but something in me resisted. Why should I have to prove anything to this woman? This was my home. I belonged here. And if the police wanted to hear an explanation, they could hear it outside, where this whole ridiculous situation started. A few minutes later, the familiar sight of flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of my house. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and two uniformed officers stepped out. My heart pounded, not because I was guilty of anything, but because I knew how unpredictable these situations could be. I had heard too many horror stories about misunderstandings turning into something worse. Mrs. Caldwell immediately waved them down like she was reporting a burglary in progress. "Officers, over here," she called, pointing directly at me. One of the officers, a tall man with a tired expression, approached cautiously. The other, a younger officer, stayed back, his eyes scanning the area as if expecting to find some kind of evidence of wrongdoing. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" the older officer asked. Mrs. Caldwell huffed dramatically. "This person is trespassing," she declared. "I've never seen them before, and they've been loitering in this backyard all afternoon. I believe they may be homeless or possibly squatting." I couldn't help but scoff. "Are you serious?" I said, standing up. "I live here. This is my house." The officer turned his gaze to me, his face neutral. "All right, sir. Can I see some identification?" I took a deep breath. I had expected this, but it still stung. The fact that someone could simply say I didn't belong, and I had to prove otherwise, felt completely unfair. But I wasn't about to escalate the situation. "Yeah, sure," I muttered, turning toward the sliding door that led inside my house. "Wait!" Mrs. Caldwell suddenly shrieked. "You can't let him go inside. What if he's lying? He could be a criminal." I stopped dead in my tracks. "Excuse me?" The younger officer, who had remained silent until now, sighed and held up a hand. "Ma'am, please let us handle this." Mrs. Caldwell wasn't satisfied. She turned to the officers and lowered her voice like she was sharing some deep, dark secret. "Look, I know the people who actually own this house," she whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "They're out of town a lot. This guy must have broken in and taken over. My patience was hanging by a thread." "Oh, really?" I said, arms crossed. "Who exactly are these supposed homeowners?" She hesitated for half a second. "A family. A very nice family. A husband, a wife, and 2 kids. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean me? I'm the homeowner. There is no wife, no kids. Just me. And I own this house." The older officer rubbed his forehead, clearly already exhausted with this nonsense. "Sir, if you could just get your ID, we can clear this up quickly." I turned toward my back door again, only for Mrs. Caldwell to step in front of it, physically blocking my way. "No," she insisted. "I don't trust him. He's probably going to grab something fake." That was it. I had been patient. I had kept my cool. But this was crossing a line. I took a step forward, looking her dead in the eye. "Move," I said, my voice firm. She flinched but didn't budge. "I don't have to do anything. I'm protecting my neighbors." "From what?" I shot back. "A man trying to enjoy his own backyard? You are trespassing right now. You came onto my property, harassed me, and now you're trying to block me from my own home?" The officers exchanged glances, and finally, the younger one spoke up. "Ma'am, you need to step aside." Mrs. Caldwell gasped like she had just been personally attacked. "I can't believe this. You're actually believing him?" "Step aside," the older officer repeated, his patience clearly wearing thin. With a dramatic huff, she finally moved, arms still crossed tightly over her chest. "You'll see," she muttered. "I know I'm right." I ignored her and stepped inside. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with sheer rage. I grabbed my wallet off the kitchen counter, along with the utility bill, and marched right back outside. I handed both items to the officer, who examined them carefully. After a few moments, he nodded. Everything checks out, he said. This is his house. I folded my arms, waiting for Mrs. Caldwell to acknowledge how utterly wrong she was. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. I don't believe it, she hissed. That doesn't prove anything. He probably faked it, or stole someone's identity. The officer sighed, clearly done with her nonsense. The younger one turned to me. Sir, do you want to press charges for trespassing? That caught her attention. What? She shrieked. I'm the victim here. I looked at her, considering it. I wanted to press charges. I wanted her to finally face consequences for her constant harassment. But then I realized something. She wanted me to lose my temper. She wanted to play the victim. So instead, I smiled. No, officer. I don't want to waste more of my time on this nonsense. But I would like you to tell her to stay off my property from now on. The older officer nodded. Ma'am, you are officially warned. If you step onto this property again without permission, you will be trespassing. Do you understand? Mrs. Caldwell was fuming, her face red as a tomato. This is insane, she spat. You'll all regret this. You'll see. But the officers didn't care. They tipped their hats and walked back to their cruiser. As they drove away, I turned to Mrs. Caldwell, giving her a look of pure amusement. Well, I said, that didn't go how you planned, huh? She glared at me one last time before storming back to her house. I shook my head, exhaling. This wasn't over. I knew that much. But at least for today, I had won. The police car had barely disappeared down the street when Mrs. Caldwell turned back toward me, her face still twisted in rage. I half expected her to start shouting again, but instead, she just stood there, gripping the fence post so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mouth opened and closed a few times like she was debating whether to spew more nonsense or just admit defeat. But I knew women like her, apologies weren't in their vocabulary. So instead of acknowledging how absurd she had been, she did what she always did. She doubled down. You might have fooled them, she finally muttered, her voice low and seething. But you won't fool me. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, give it a rest, Caldwell, I said, shaking my head. You embarrassed yourself today. Maybe take the loss and move on. Her nostrils flared. You think this is over? I let out a short laugh. I know it's over. And with that, I turned my back on her and headed inside, locking the door behind me. I should have felt victorious. I had shut her down, proven her wrong, and even had the cops tell her to stay off my property. But as I stood in my kitchen, staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to something insane. My phone was blowing up with messages, texts from friends, notifications from my neighborhood Facebook group, and even a couple of missed calls. Confused, I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and unlocked my phone, scrolling through the chaos. That's when I saw it. A post from Mrs. Caldwell. She had taken a picture of my house, my own house, and plastered it all over social media, claiming that it had been taken over by a dangerous squatter. The caption read, Police car light alert. There is a homeless trespasser living in our neighborhood. He has refused to leave and even tricked the police into believing he owns the house. If you see him, do not approach. Call authorities immediately. We must protect our community from people like this. I stared at my phone, stunned. The comment section was a nightmare. Some people were skeptical, but others, they were eating it up. Oh my gosh, we need to do something. How did the police let this happen? I knew something was off about that house. My heart started racing. This woman had officially lost her mind. It was one thing to harass me in person, but now she was spreading outright lies about me online, and people were believing her. Before I could even figure out how to respond, there was a loud bang on my front door. I jumped, my pulse spiking. Who the hell? Another bang, and then a voice. Hey, we know you're in there. I froze. That wasn't the police. It was neighbors. I rushed to my window and peeked outside. A small group of people had gathered on my lawn, some holding their phones, others just standing there, glaring at my house like they were waiting for me to come out and confess to a crime I hadn't committed. This was getting insane. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and did the only thing I could think of. I started filming. I opened the door slightly, phone in hand. Can I help you? I asked, keeping my voice calm. A middle-aged man I barely recognized stepped forward. "We saw the post," he said firmly. "We know you're not supposed to be here." I narrowed my eyes. "What post?" "You know damn well what post," a woman in the back shouted. "The one about you squatting in this house." I let out a short laugh. "Squatting? I own this house." "Prove it," another voice called. I turned my camera toward the crowd. "So let me get this straight," I said, keeping my tone steady. "You all saw one Facebook post from a woman who's been harassing me for years, and instead of, I don't know, minding your business, you decided to show up at my house like a damn mob?" A few people hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't have to prove anything to you," I continued. "But since you're all so desperate for the truth, let me make this real simple." I flipped my camera to selfie mode and stared directly into it. "My name is your name. I have lived in this house for years. I own this house." "And Mrs. Caldwell?" "She's a lying, racist, delusional old woman who can't stand the fact that she was wrong. And if any of you step foot on my property again, I will press charges." Silence. A few people muttered under their breath and started backing away. One woman pulled out her phone, probably checking to see if what I said was true. And when she did, the color drained from her face. "He's telling the truth," she whispered. The man in front of me swallowed hard. "Oh, well, you just what?" I snapped. "Blindly followed a Facebook post like sheep? Congratulations. You all look real smart right now." Nobody knew what to say. One by one, they started walking away, embarrassed, avoiding eye contact. Except for Mrs. Caldwell. She stood in the distance, watching the whole thing unfold, her face twisted in silent rage. When she saw me looking, she turned and stormed back into her house. I exhaled slowly, my heart still pounding. I wasn't sure what her next move would be, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over.